So, welcome everyone to the Fall 2024 book talk for the Society for the Advancement of Scandinavian Study. I'm Olivia Noble-Gunn, Associate Professor and the Sverre Aristad Endowed Chair in Norwegian Studies at the University of Washington, Seattle, and I am the current Vice President of SAS. The SAS Book Talk is a biannual event taking place online in the fall and in person at the SAS conference in the spring. And it's a great opportunity for us to come together as a community to learn about and celebrate our colleagues' new and upcoming publications. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. William Banks, who will be in conversation with Dr. Benjamin Teitelbaum about his latest book, The Great Debate, Nietzsche, Culture, and the Scandinavian Welfare Society. This is the first full translation of a crucial historical debate between Georg Brandes and Harald Høffding, published this year by the University of Wisconsin Press. William Banks is a writer, editor, and translator. He received his PhD in Scandinavian Studies from the University of Wisconsin in 2013 and previously taught at the University of Minnesota. He's also the editor and translator of Georg Brandes' Human Rights and Oppressed Peoples, Collected Essays and Speeches, also from the University of Wisconsin Press, and the translator of Pelle Dragsted's Nordic Socialism, The Path Toward a Democratic Economy, which is forthcoming from the University of Wisconsin Press in 2025. He is a regular contributor to Jacobin. Benjamin Teitelbaum is Associate Professor of Musicology and International Affairs and former head of Nordic Studies at the University of Colorado, Boulder. He is a scholar of radical politics, ideology, and culture, and author of Lions of the North from Oxford University Press and War for Eternity from Penguin. In addition to scholarship, his commentary on politics appears in the Wall Street Journal, The Atlantic, and the New York Times, and he was recently named to Radio France's 100 Thinkers in International Relations. Before we get started, I want to note that we welcome nominations for featured authors for our book talks from any SAS member, including authors themselves, on a rolling basis. And we have also featured works of fiction in the recent past, so the genre category is open. If you're interested, you can find instructions for how to nominate online, or you can always come and talk to me about it as well. There'll be time for questions after the conversation, and you can put your questions into the Q&A at any time, as Kimberly has already said. So once again, welcome to our audience. Thank you for joining us, and welcome to William and Benjamin. Thank you for sharing your work, time, and expertise with us this afternoon.
Thank you, Professor Gunn. It's a pleasure to be here. Everyone, of course, this is an event where we expect and hope to learn and to think critically, but it is, and I'm really pleased that Professor Gunn said this is also an opportunity for celebration, for celebrating those among our ranks among Scandinavian studies scholars. This is a remarkable achievement, I think, both for our author, our translator, William Banks, Dr. William Banks, and also for the University of Wisconsin Press. Please forgive me if I begin my remarks today by gushing a little bit. On page 4 of the introduction, a substantial introduction to this translated volume, our author today, William Banks, says that this text, this exchange, would be of interest to 3 categories of readers. 1, Nietzsche scholars. 2nd, ostensibly us, Scandinavian studies scholars. And 3rd, young people interested in the Nordic welfare system and the Nordic model more generally. If there is anything that I would criticize in the opening of this book, it would be that our author, William Banks, perhaps undersells himself. Because throughout the pages that follow, we see a discussion that that captures so much more than that and makes this text, I think, the concern of an even broader readership. The ideas that we're encountering between these 2 Danish authors, the contextualization, the mobilization of those ideas that we get so aptly and so articulately put by our author, William Banks, are, in my understanding, some of the same issues that we are debating on op-ed pages every single day in the United States. We hear it in podcasts, we hear it on social media. There are questions about how our society is to be organized, what should be done with excesses and concentrations of wealth and opportunity, and how can a collective and how can an individual lead a good life? These questions have been forced to the forefront by political developments, not only in the United States, but throughout Europe and beyond. And it makes all of this, and I don't want to use this term flippant, but it makes all of this urgent, essential reading. This text that our author William Banks put together. The text itself, the book, the publication, The Great Debate, Nietzsche, Culture, and the Scandinavian Welfare Society, Georg Brandes and Harald Høffding, follows an exchange that took place between these two Danish writers from 1889 until 1890. A relatively short window of time in each of their collective output. The exchange between the two is heated at times. There are moments of personal vitriol, although we learn in William's excellent introduction that the two ended their lives on very good terms, even friends, perhaps. But what they were discussing were core values that end up mobilizing the Scandinavian welfare system. And I'm sure that we will get comments and questions when we get to the question section of our session this morning relating to Brandes, perhaps to Nietzsche as well, perhaps to the history of the Nordic welfare state. But for those of you who haven't had a chance to read this fine publication yet, I'd like to ask our author for today, William, to start introducing it to us. And I'd ask you, William, if you would perhaps introduce it to us in this way. If we are thinking about Brandes and Høffding as two political parties, if the two of them are ambassadors or archetypes of two different political platforms, what would those two platforms be?
Okay. The party of aristocratic radicalism and the party of democratic radicalism. I should probably begin by saying that I would be satisfied with neither. Personally, I would be satisfied with neither. I would be opposed on every point to the party of aristocratic radicalism. I would be deeply sympathetic to Høffding's democratic radicals, but I do have some problems with that particular program as well. I guess if I could start with the aristocratic radicals, I should probably just define a little bit about what defines the central animating ideas. The first of these is that aristocratic radicalism has a particular theory of value. I take that term from economics, but they are using it in the domain of aesthetics and culture. And that theory of value, let's call it a theory of cultural value, is that everything of value in culture, every expression of the human spirit that is worthy, necessarily originates in the mind of a single extraordinary individual. Okay? So the work of art, the work of culture, is conceived as emerging directly from the personality of the individual artist. There is no conception of the artist as a concluding figure at the end of a long process of an entire culture, an entire species contributing to the work of art. Now, this is one way of illustrating this is, I note in the book that this was all written before Bakhtin, right? So the aristocratic radical would look at Bakhtin's novel, Bakhtin's study of Rabelais with contempt, right? Because the central argument of Bakhtin is that Rabelais did not invent these images with which he populates his grand novel. They were taken from popular culture, right? From the culture of carnival. That's completely rejected. The aristocratic radical argues that everything of cultural value in the world comes from a very small number of individuals. I use the figure 6 to 8. The second part of aristocratic radicalism is its diagnosis. The central problem of modernity is the masses, and particularly the demands of the masses for democratic participation. It's the masses and it's democracy that are the problems. What we really need to do is get out of the way of the great individuals, right? They will take care of all of our problems, essentially. And it is also a program for the reconstruction of society itself. Because the central problem of modernity is restiveness among the mob, revolts of the unwashed masses, what is desperately needed is a radical reassertion of elite power against the masses. The masses need to be returned to an imagined position in the ancien regime, sometime in the 17th or 16th century. Okay? Democratic radicalism, Høffding's response. Importantly, and I'm not sure if Høffding actually believes this, Høffding begins by conceding that cultural theory of value. Høffding says at numerous points in the back and forth that we will always have need of an aristocracy. We will always have need for single great individuals who are the source of everything good in the world, right? He concedes that. I'm not certain if he actually believes that. It might just be a rhetorical or a argumentative gesture. But anyways, that's how the debate progresses. That is also my principal objection to democratic radicalism. The debate then becomes, as you mentioned, it's definitely not a debate about aesthetics, although that is how it is remembered in Scandinavian literary memory. It is a debate ultimately about the cultural organization of society, right? If it is true that everything good in the world comes from 6 or 8 people, then we have to figure out how to organize society so that we can produce such people, and that when we do produce such people, that they are given absolute deference from ordinary people, right? The non-great, and that they are given all the resources they need. All the resources need to be put at their disposal so that they can create good things for us, right? For Brandes, and certainly for Nietzsche, the way to do that is to put all of the resources at the disposal of the great individuals, right? For Høffding counters with a very, very strange argument, largely taken from economics. It's fundamentally the argument from efficiency. Høffding argues that the problem we have is that we need to find out how to have a better elite. He says an elite whose superiority is grounded in genuine intellectual and spiritual ability, right? And the best way we can do that is effectively with a uniquely Nordic conception of the utilitarian tradition. He says that we need to provide as much opportunity as possible for as many people as possible so that a few diamonds will emerge from the rough. And both Brandes and Høffding acknowledge that there are diamonds in the rough, right? It's an important point for both of them. Brandes ultimately believes, or at least argues here, that we shouldn't waste too much time and energy on the rough, right? We ought to give everything to to the diamonds. Høffding ultimately resorts to what I call the pose of epistemic humility. Another thing he takes from economic thought. Because we can't know who the diamonds are, because there's no magical way of identifying them, the best course of action is then to provide basic opportunities for everyone and let the sort of intellectual, artistic, cultural marketplace sort it out. Okay, I think that would be the fundamental distinction. There is one more important thing. As I describe in the book, Nietzsche and Brandes are fundamentally coming from a deeply conservative position. I place them in a lineage of aristocratic reaction tracing back to 1789, and I place Høffding in the beginnings of the social democratic tradition. Now, one important point about the party of aristocratic radicals, if they had to win an election, as is the thought experiment here, they probably wouldn't speak in the manner I just spoke, right? They would not present their ideas in such a manner. Conservatives, aristocratic reactionaries have understood since 1789 that they can't simply go to the people and say, love us, admire us, vote for us because we are better than you, right? They have to come up with appeals that have a broader resonance than among themselves, right? So I think there's a fundamental dishonesty at the heart of if there was to be a party of aristocratic radicalism, right? Very long answer.
If we can take that for a moment. So the point that you were speaking to at the end was that there is a sort of fundamental mismatch between the motivations of someone in Brandes's camp, the aristocratic drive, and the logic of democracy. I asked you to speak as though these were two political parties, and of course, if the logic of democracy is to try and galvanize as many people as possible, numbers, so that you can gain electoral representation and political power by virtue of having gathered together a quantity of sympathizers. Perhaps there's something fundamentally at odds then with a movement that actually does not believe in numbers and masses. But this gets to the point. I mean, what sort of popular cause could be derived from what Brandes had to say? A follow-up question to that is to ask for motivations. Part of, by the way, just a quick tangent, part of what I like so much about this book is that it helps elucidate something that has been written about, but it isn't talked about that often, which is the sort of metaphysics behind social democracy, and the ethical value beyond sheer egalitarianism or equality as an end in and of itself. Why do Brandes and Høffding want to see great individuals succeed? What is going to be the product of success of either the unhinged aristocrat or the victor in a meritocratic fight? That seems to be the underlying drive for Høffding.
As you might expect, they're diametrically opposed on this question, and that is one of the two main points of contention I focus on in the introduction. And I should distinguish here between Nietzsche's view and Brandes's view, because, and this is part of why I want Nietzsche scholars to read the book, it's important. Every Nietzsche scholar knows who Georg Brandes is. They know that he wrote Aristocratic Radicalism, which has been available in German and English for more than 100 years. What nobody knows about is the debate. The other 5 essays are appearing for the first time in a language other than Danish. And what I really want Nietzsche scholars to understand is that Brandes lost the debate. It was, in a sense, a rout for Høffding. And Brandes is compelled in the back and forth to establish some distance between himself and Nietzsche, right? this is what I would like to get out of here. When Nietzsche entered the public sphere, it was a defeat, right? Eventually, obviously, he has a pretty dramatic comeback. But anyway, back to the question. For Nietzsche, the great individual is conceived biologically. The great individual, a Goethe or a Shakespeare, is conceived as the very purpose of nature, the purpose of biological evolution. Nature fails more than 99.9% of the time when it creates a human being. The vast majority, the overwhelming majority of human beings are misfires, fundamentally. But occasionally, maybe once or twice in a generation, it hits the jackpot, and you have the great personality. And when this happens, nature smiles, right? Nature feels like it has accomplished its goal. Brandes, one of the misunderstandings he has in his portrait is that he takes that biological basis and he historicizes it, right? He says that the purpose of history, his teleological view of history, is that history is seeking the perfect personality, right? So all of Roman history was culminated in the figure of Julius Caesar, right? And Høffding, on the other hand, and this is what the debate largely becomes about, argues that yes, great individuals are very important. They are the source of everything novel in the world, but you're conceiving them incorrectly. The great individual is ultimately a servant of the species, right? So a figure like Copernicus is a great individual because he corrected our fundamental misunderstanding of the solar system, right? And so what we have here is a question of who are the great individuals for? For Nietzsche, and this is, I think, one of the most disturbing aspects of his, by and large, extremely disturbing thought. And that is that the great works of art that are produced by the great personality are not for the masses. They are for the small circle of the elite, right? I'm going to tell a story that I always tell when I talk about the book, and that is my last encounter with Nietzsche before this was in a graduate seminar at Wisconsin, and we were reading the English translations of The Will to Power, Nietzsche's unpublished manuscripts. And I was really struggling with that text. I couldn't understand any of it. And I asked a question in class. And the question went like this. It's clear to me that what Nietzsche seeks is a movement for the spiritual revitalization of decadent Europe, right? He uses the word, Bewegung, all over, right? And my question was, is this movement he seeks a mass movement, right? Does he want to reshape the whole of society? And the professor was deeply uncomfortable because in one sense, the answer is absolutely not. It's only 6 or 8 guys who are going to be spiritually revitalized, right? But in order for this movement to succeed, the great mass of humanity has to be mobilized in service of that project, right? That was maybe the darkest day of graduate school for me when that when that came ultimately into my mind. So Høffding is the very opposite. We need these great individuals because they will develop something like pasteurization of milk, right? Or they will build the Hagia Sophia, right? Brandes gets caught in the middle, and his answer is ultimately unsatisfying. And in the end, he kind of has to concede, you're right, I'm wrong. Although he definitely does not admit that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. If we think so, if Høffding really delivers a knockout blow,
Yeah,
at least to the Nietzschean pole opposite him, and Brandes is kind of swept along in that current, and it is to say the only purpose for an elite, for distinguished individuals, the only reason society ought mobilize in any way on their behalf is because the fruits of their labor will benefit the rest of us.
right.
It's in that way that we will experience progress.
Right.
That now, of course, that I don't think it's any great leap to say that that is probably going to sound like a more sympathetic argument to basically anyone in a democratic society or with a democratized mindset. But it leads me to wonder what innovations took place in this exchange. Not aristocratic radicalism per se, as you mentioned, but the debate, this crucial debate that follows, that is the innovation of your text.
Mm-hmm. Innovations. Let me think about this for a second. In one very, with respect to the history of ideas, to intellectual history, the major innovation is this is the first time that the concept of the welfare society is contested in the Nordic public sphere. The first that I know. There may have been things going on a bit earlier, but as far as I can tell, this is the first time that two people argued over the concept of the welfare society. It wasn't called that yet. Høffding had actually coined the term in Danish. It had existed in German, as I think Wohlfahrt. Høffding coins a Danish term, velfærdsprincip, right? The welfare principle, which sounds on the surface and has often been misinterpreted as just a Danish translation of the utilitarian calculus of Jeremy Bentham and the Mills. But it's more than that. There is a book about this by a Danish author, Lasse Horne Kjeldgaard, which I would recommend. But it's fundamentally, the welfare principle is fundamentally different from the Anglophone utilitarian principle. It's extremely complicated philosophically, but the basic idea is that Stuart Mill, James Mill, Jeremy Bentham were all working comfortably within the Anglophone liberal tradition. And their utilitarian ethics, which certainly accounts for other human beings other than the self, is all framed within a larger effort to keep individual self-interest at the center of the ethics, right? So in the end, because they were fundamentally within that Anglophone liberal tradition, they want to make their ethical system work without asking for altruism, without asking for other directed behavior. Høffding largely dispenses with this. The basic principle he uses in the welfare principle would be sympathy, medfølelse in Danish. He doesn't use the term solidarism, but it's certainly implied. That would come a bit later. And up to the present day, I would argue I'm definitely one of the people who believe that the Nordic model is qualitatively distinct from the Anglophone and continental models of welfare societies as defined by Esping Andersen. That is the important distinction there. And that is why the development of the British welfare state went in one direction, and the Scandinavian welfare state went in a different direction. The basic principle is solidarism. In our country, in England, and even in much of the continent, there isn't this bold embrace of the idea that we are going to provide comprehensive services from cradle to grave, and that we're all going to pay for this together, and some will be paying more than others will, right? That's fundamentally at what Høffding is talking about here. And this is the first time it's debated. Brandes obviously detests it, as Nietzsche did, but I don't think he picks up on that distinction, right? They were both friends with Stuart Mill, and Brandes attempts to use Stuart Mill against Høffding. It kind of backfires, but that's the central innovation, I think, that comes out of it, is that this is the first time this basic idea is seriously discussed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And if we focus on Høffding more, you opened, after my opening question to you, clarifying, giving us a disclaimer that you're actually not a sympathizer with either of our two protagonists.
Mm-hmm.
And if Høffding, if his retort is based on the idea that, well, we ought to provide a system that gives everyone a fair chance and a good chance,
mm-hmm.
What is kind of colloquially referred to as an equality of opportunity,
mm-hmm.
in part, and also good opportunities, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
This is motivated because the actual diamonds in the rough that exist there are going to be bolstered, and they're going to be enabled to do their good. This is again a meritocratic system, a belief that there can be an elite, but it needs to be elite not by virtue of birth, but by virtue of achievements and accomplishments.
Mm-hmm.
What is the legacy of that idea in the Nordic countries? What is the legacy of that meritocratic
Right.
deal? And I would love also to hear if after that you could also tell us a bit about your impressions of that and why that still
Right.
doesn't seem like a sympathetic agenda for you.
Okay. In the Nordic countries, this is something that for those of us who participate in the largely online debates between market fundamentalist liberals and Scandinavian social democrats, right? This comes up a lot. And my side, our side, likes to come back with pretty clear statistics that economic and social mobility in the Nordic countries is the highest in the world, and it is in a different galaxy than in the Anglophone countries. So if you just divide the population into quintiles, if you're born in the bottom or the second to bottom quintile in Denmark, you have a higher chance of moving up to the second or third than anywhere else in the world. So in that respect, I think they got it right. I think the welfare society as it existed and in somewhat diminished forms that it exists today has done a much better job with equality of opportunity, right? My own view, and you absolutely pinpointed the problem I have with democratic radicalism and what got me thinking about this. And that is that really two things. One is that this is, on the surface, this debate is fundamentally about the cultural organization of society. And at the same time, the issue of the political, social, and economic organization of society, let's just call it the social organization of society, cannot be kept at bay. because the cultural organization implies a social organization. So if we discard that and we say, let's just treat democratic radicalism as a theory of the cultural organization of society, I think it's fine. The way I would say this is that with respect to culture, it is plenty enough to ensure that every girl has a chance to grow up and become Nancy Griffith. Okay, Nancy Griffith, the folk singer. That's perfectly reasonable and maybe even the best means of the cultural organization of society. What it cannot account, what it cannot be transformed into is a theory of the social organization of society, because Nancy Griffith is an exception, right? Only a handful of human beings in our century were capable of singing like her and writing songs like her, right? And that's fine for culture. You can base a model of the cultural organization of society on exceptions. What you cannot do is base a social theory on exceptions, right? Everyone in America has a chance to become a tech billionaire. I'm going to try to avoid naming names today. Everyone has a chance to have a net worth of $350 billion, right? The problem is only a handful of people can have $350 billion, right? There's the rest of us. There's the 99.9%. What are our lives supposed to be like, right? And I think that gets confused in the back and forth of the debate. And it, even more so, I would argue that it has confused our contemporary understanding of meritocracy, right? Because I think an awful lot of people, including the vast majority of people who are not billionaires, believe that it is enough, right? It is sufficient to say, well, there's nothing stopping me from becoming one of these people myself. The other aspect of it, which I thought would attract more interest from readers, but relatively it has not, is this got me thinking about the very idea of meritocracy itself and its use as the basic principle of social organization. And the problem that I found was that if you believe that economic and social inequality are a problem, and that it is imperative that we take measures to redress the exploding inequality all over the world, it seems to me that meritocracy, the concept of meritocracy, offers no solution to this problem. In fact, I would argue that meritocracy makes it worse, that it makes it more just, right? That we include marginalized groups. It makes it a much more just world. But if we are going to provide the best opportunities and the best resources to the most meritocratic individuals, all I can see them doing is taking even more for themselves. Okay? So I did a little thought experiment. If we had a machine and every time a baby is born, they take a blood sample and they get a meritocratic score, right? From 1 to 10. If you're at 10, that means you're put on the fast track, right? You get everything an individual could ever want in terms of opportunity and resources. That would be a much more just world, right? But it would also be more unequal, because if you really have the most capable people in positions of power, they're just going to take more for themselves. It's going to increase the the distance between the top and the bottom. And I think this can be humorously turned on its head. And I actually sort of half jokingly in the book argue that the aristocratic principle is, in a curious way, a kind of break on inequality, because we are far from the world where we have the meritocratic machine, right? There are an awful lot of morons in positions of power and influence. And they, well, again, I'm not going to name names, but imagine, okay, I'm going to name one name. Jared Kushner made the worst real estate deal in the history of the world. He bought the building on Fifth Avenue for $1.8 billion, right? He was ultimately bailed out by investors from the Middle East. But I think we can say that Jared Kushner, the son of a brilliant real estate developer who has problems of his own, Jared Kushner is not good at real estate. And yet he is in control of an investment fund of $3 billion. He's probably going to blow it all, right? So that's the little curious relationship I have there between the meritocratic and the aristocratic principle. But the central serious idea is that meritocracy cannot address the problem of inequality, right? That's what I want to emphasize.
And in that respect, we see not an opposition between our two figures, Brandes and Høffding, but instead we see a synthesis that emerges at the tail end of their discussion. They both, in some way, in your telling, emerge as enemies of equality, or more equitable society. And that, hence the question about the legacy of these ideas that I'd like to get to. So I'm speaking to you right now. We're not from Colorado. I'm on a fieldwork assignment. I'm in El Segundo in Southern California. I'm going to be following and shadowing some tech executives. You said you weren't going to mention any names, but Elon Musk, Peter Thiel are looming large these days. David Sachs is in the news. You write about the contemporary legacy of these ideas, and you write that their legacy actually might not always be pointing toward the Nordic welfare society in the Nordic welfare state, but instead something else. So before we turn over to questions, because I would very much like to invite our audience to participate in this conversation. But before you do, can you briefly talk to us about how you see this alternative parallel and indeed more perhaps legacy of these ideas?
Right. It works like this. Democratic radicalism won the debate in 1890, and the development of Nordic society and really all of Western European society looked a lot more like democratic radicalism than aristocratic radicalism for most of the 20th century. And then beginning in the 1970s, we changed course. And it takes some time. Well, fundamentally, what happens in the 70s and 80s is that the economic conditions that permit enormous concentrations of capital are optimized, right? So there were billionaires in the 1960s and 1950s. They're pretty laughable when you look at the billionaires we have today. It takes some time for the winners and losers to be sorted out. But by the 1990s and turbocharged ever since then, you start to see the accumulation of immense amounts of capital in single individuals. You name three of them. Okay, and this is the part that has definitely gotten the most pushback in reviews and in previous book talks I've given. I try to basically say that the world we inhabit now is sort of infected by a reemergence of the ideology of aristocratic radicalism. Okay, so democratic radicalism won in the short term, but it's aristocratic radicalism that ultimately won the day and shapes the world we live in now. There were important couple developments in the 20th century that I think contributed to this, and one of them, probably the most critique part of the book, would be my own critique of cultural studies. This is pretty important for the overall argument of the book. I was educated in cultural studies in graduate school. I participated in it and continue to participate in it. And I believe it was a necessary project to bring down the greats of the canonical greats of culture and to lift up popular or folk culture. At the same time, I think we were wrong to believe that we were striking a blow against the concept of greatness itself. That we no longer teach a course on Shakespeare and just talk about how awesome it is, right? That was not good. We do a much better job now. But in bringing down, let's say in leveling the differences between what used to be called high culture and low culture, and treating everything the same, I think that we, in effect, left a kind of spiritual vacuum or void. That's the key term in the book, because to be an ordinary person is, in my opinion, to venerate people whom you see as above you. I consider myself an ordinary person. I'm surrounded by ordinary people and came from very ordinary stock. I don't think that there is anything unhealthy about this inherently. And I do think another problem I have with cultural studies is that ordinary people can recognize the difference between an authentic, uplifting, edifying expression of human spirit and the most regressive, worst kind of popular culture, right? I think that ability is there in every one of us. And I also hold that every single ordinary person has a deep and profound need for contact with the highest expressions of the human spirit, right? And I think in taking that away, taking away what we used to fill it up with, right? We left it open for someone else. And that was filled by people like Elon Musk and Peter Thiel, right? Because we don't have any examples anymore of great figures of culture or any other domain of human expression, it was gladly, willingly, forcefully occupied by effectively the people who have the most wealth, right? So that's a part of it. And the other important aspect of the return of aristocratic radicalism is related to that, but it comes from the other side of the political spectrum. And that would be, I have a long section in the introduction on Hayek, the market fundamentalist economist. And effectively, what I think has happened is that what we used to valorize as greatness of intellect or spirit has been moved over into greatness of capital accumulation, right? So what was once called, in Nietzsche's mind, the artist, poet, philosopher, has been subsumed by what I call the entrepreneurial Promethean. And the principal figure in this process is Hayek. This is what I would call the soft aspect of the neoliberal program. It is, in its essence, we need to make capitalism cool. So I'm a child of the 80s and 90s. capitalism was not cool. We did not look up to Jack Welch, General Electric guy. We looked up to different kinds of figures. That's changed, obviously. And I think that was a conscious program of propaganda by the neoliberal world to impart. Corey Robin, the political scientist, would say to impart a measure of the heroic, the daring, the aesthetic, right? To aestheticize capital accumulation. And so in the end, I think it is Hayek who won this debate. Nietzsche effectively got half of the world he wanted. He got his reassertion of elite power, but it's simply the wrong kind of elite, right? Nietzsche would not be happy that people think that Peter Thiel is a philosopher.
Right. Right. In big picture, we see, again, that's one of the themes from the book. I think we see this, if you look at the contemporary legacy of this, you see this transfer from culture to tech or money, perhaps, as a measure of elitism. I'd like to invite all of our listeners to participate in this conversation. And in doing so, I'm going to turn things over to Professor Gunn as well. Olivia, are you there to handle?
Thank you so much, Ben.
I'm here.
That was wonderful. If I could just thank Ben for the best interview I've ever done by far and away.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes.
Easy
So
done.
thank you, Ben, for the interview, and thank you, William, for being here and sharing your work with us. And yes, we have time for questions. I'm going to be paying attention to the Q&A, so please do put your questions there. Since you're all on the screen, you can also raise your hand if that's a preferable mode for you. I see a hand from Frankie Shackelford.
Hi, Olivia. I just wanted to know if I was really there. But I am.
You're there, Frankie.
I'm there. Hi, William.
You're there.
Fantastic job. I can't wait to read your book.
Thank you so much.
I cashed in my Nietzsche Scholar card already in 1974. So, and my Georg Brandes card at the end of my dissertation in 77. And I'm stuck somewhere else in contemporary culture. But I just want to say the book sounds fascinating, and I want to read it.
That's a good question. I haven't thought about it. Yes, he's certainly part of the he would call them the global community of, the term he used was free spirits, right? However, and this becomes if you read the essays of the debate, it's really catty at points. It gets out of control at several points, and of course it's Brandes who is the primary aggressor. Høffding is a model enlightened liberal bourgeois professor. Civil discourse means everything to him. Brandes is not. He describes himself as an intellectual franc-tireur, my French pronunciation there, an intellectual guerrilla warrior, effectively. But all the bad feelings are started by Høffding, because Høffding does something really lame in his first article. He plays the disciplinary card. He says, like Brandes, this is a great article. Nietzsche is a very interesting writer, but what he is not is a philosopher, right? And if he had actually paid more attention in his philosophy classes, and more importantly, if you, Brandes, had taken your degree in philosophy and become a professor like me, then you would be able to understand that this is literature and not philosophy, right? And that is a pretty lame thing to do. I don't understand for the life of me why he would do such a thing. Once he sort of takes the cap off, Brandes just explodes, right? And fires back with everything he has for the next 6 months. But the reason I bring that up is Høffding really hit a sore spot. Brandes said several times in his life. So Brandes was a literary critic and a literary historian, right? And a public intellectual, a man of letters is the old term. In several interviews spanning most of his career, when he's asked about this question, what are you? He says, I am more than a literary critic, but less than a philosopher, right? There's no name for what I am. But he's clearly saying, I'm not just some dumb guy who writes book reviews, right? But I'm also not Nietzsche. And Høffding quoted that back to him and said, you know, you don't have a philosophy degree, you're not a professor, and you yourself say you're not a philosopher, right? So I'm going to tell you everything you got wrong in this essay. So I guess one more important aspect of this would be biographical. There is a section on that in the introduction. It's a very curious relationship. As probably everyone knows here, and I mentioned, Brandes did not become a professor. He gave a lecture on November 3rd, 1871, the most important literary lecture in Scandinavian history. It launched what we call the modern breakthrough. It also destroyed any hope he ever had of having an academic career, right? So Brandes effectively becomes an outsider. He spends his life as an independent critic and historian. He does get to teach at Copenhagen, but he's effectively an adjunct, right? Høffding is precisely the opposite. He scales the greasy pole of academia, right? He does every single thing that is expected of him. It takes him 12 years, but he's eventually named a professor. He publishes books that are important academic works. His psychology textbook was translated into most European languages, was a standard textbook in Germany and other countries. His ethics was translated into English. He was invited to Harvard University. All of the things that a good professor, every feather in his cap he gets. What he is not is a famous person, right? And Brandes very much was a famous person. Brandes is outside of the academy, but his impact on the public sphere and even on academia itself, right, is far greater than Høffding's. It's also why nobody remembers who Høffding is to this day. Brandes is the major figure. And so you've got an outsider who is much larger than an insider, right, who has the credentials. That's another aspect of this debate. And Brandes certainly thinks that Høffding has never had an original thought in his life. And that's why he's so insulted. Like, who are you to pass judgment on a figure, on a thinker of the caliber of Nietzsche, right? Okay. And yes, he had a gigantic ego, Brandes.
There are two questions in the chat now, so let's make sure to take care of those. There's a question from Theo who writes, this raises some troubling questions about disability, a subject close to my heart. Your meritocratic thought experiment, we could equally argue that those who score low should get all the resources.
That's what I would argue.
Early educational interventions for autistic children would be in line with this. And so they write, the book sounds fantastic, by the way. I look forward to reading it, but what is your response to sort of questions about maybe from a disability studies perspective?
My view is precisely the same as yours, Theo. I think in a way we have it precisely backwards. It's the young people with the I have to choose my language. It's the young people with the greatest needs with respect to education, who should receive more resources than those for whom everything comes easy. Absolutely. About disability itself, I should also mention, I forgot to mention this, I'm the farthest thing from a Nietzsche scholar, and I treated these texts, the portrait that Brandes draws of Nietzsche, as an autonomous figure, right? So I don't do anything in the book. I do translate. So Brandes will quote Nietzsche in Brandes's own Danish translation, sometimes in German, but most often in his own translation. So I had to, what I called side translate Brandes's Danish into English, and then I had to go and find the original German, right? So the footnotes are extensive. So I do treat Brandes's Nietzsche as an autonomous figure, and my critique of Nietzsche as it is present in the book is almost entirely from secondary sources. There is a whole, I guess I could say, a movement of us. I'm very much a junior member. 25 books published in this century alone, making this argument that Nietzsche ultimately belongs to the conservative reactionary tradition. And I rely heavily on those figures. That said, I will say one thing about Nietzsche, and that is he had some views on disabled people, and they're horrifying. Well, the term he would use is deformed. He had this intense hatred of the deformed masses, right? And argued for nothing other than could be all right, I'm not going to go there. That's enough about Nietzsche. You should definitely look into Nietzsche and the disabled. And biographically, again, Nietzsche himself was a disabled person, right? Another funny thing about the first essay, Aristocratic Radicalism, is that so this was the first substantial article written about Nietzsche in any language. It effectively introduced him to the world. And Brandes and Nietzsche were writing back and forth for a couple of years. Brandes first gives a series of lectures in 1888 and then condenses them into the essay published in 1889. Now, before he gave the lectures, he asked Nietzsche for a CV so that he could properly introduce him to the Copenhagen audience. And Nietzsche sent him a CV that is full of lies, famous misunderstandings about who Nietzsche was, where he came from. Among other things, he said that he's not actually German, he's Polish, right? And he even made up a little etymology of his name. He's Polish, and he's not only Polish, he is from the stock of the Szlachta, I believe is the Polish word for aristocracy. It's completely untrue. Nietzsche is the product of the clerical upper bourgeois, and he is German through and through. Another thing he said in there is that he was proficient with the saber, right? He served in the Prussian cavalry as a young man, right? And he mentions in that letter, I am proficient with 2 weapons, the horse and the pen, and maybe a third. I think that's the citation. The thing is, he was not proficient with the saber. In basic training, he fell off his horse. And he never really recovered. And he did serve, and he was discharged from the German army. He did serve in the war with France, but as an ambulance driver, right? So Brandes, there's a few others in there, but Brandes puts these biographical facts out there, and they stick, right, for decades. Anyway, so Nietzsche himself was discharged from the military on disability status, and then of course, he couldn't really see the disease he had, whatever it was. It's not confirmed. Made him blind for sometimes several months out of the year. And then there was his famous stomach. He had a weak stomach. He couldn't really eat anything. So Nietzsche has this image of the Germanic blonde beast, right? This warrior philosopher, right? He did not in any way reflect that in his own life. I think there is a biographical connection between his own physical disabilities, right, and then his illnesses as well, and his writings. Great.
Okay, we have a question from Troy, who asks, or who writes, Brandes and Høffding were both interpreters of Kierkegaard. We haven't had the chance to read the book yet, but Troy is wondering whether Kierkegaard plays a role, implicit or explicit, in the debate. It seems to me that Kierkegaard's literary reviews, that of H.C. Andersen's Only a Fiddler and Gyllenborg's Two Ages, would be of interest in this context, as they approach the questions of the genius and leveling, respectively. Kierkegaard appears to have been a prototype for Brandes's aristocratic radicalism, no less than Nietzsche.
Okay, this is a big issue. Kierkegaard figures not only in this debate, but he also figures in the first debate, right? So the story of these two guys is that they were the two superstar students at Copenhagen University in the 1860s. And remember, this is a small country. It doesn't have a lot of universities. I think there only might have been two at this time. But really only one. There's one university, and it's not very big. And so two students, Høffding and Brandes, are the stars. Brandes is the bigger star. In the middle of the 1860s, I'm sure, Troy, you already know about this. This is more for the audience. There was another debate. It's called the Tro og Viden debate, or the faith and knowledge debate, and it concerned some of the first Danish commentaries on Kierkegaard's writings, right? And the basic issue at contest was the role that non-rational knowledge, faith, should play in the organization of society. Brandes, not surprisingly, took the side of reason. Høffding, at that point, was a student of theology. He eventually switched to philosophy. And Høffding, in what turned out to be a very bad position, took the theological side. Because in that case, Brandes definitely wins that debate, right? And that was fundamentally an argument about Kierkegaard, right? And it's the first attempt to try to do something with his thought, right? Within Denmark. Later, that would happen in other parts of the world. Is Kierkegaard an aristocratic radical? I started out as a Kierkegaard scholar 30 years ago. I was in it for about 10 years. It's been a long time. I can say that my understanding is no. And Kierkegaard, is there are strong commonalities between between Kierkegaard and Nietzsche as thinkers. They're often thrown into the same pot. I think the fundamental difference, and this was my understanding of Kierkegaard, is that the program he lays out, the faith program he lays out, is indeed accessible to anyone, right? That you do not have to have a master's degree in theology to reach it to, I think that the final stage is religion B, right? When you've gone through all of the steps on the ladder. And I think that's deeply important to Kierkegaard himself. That's my understanding of him. It's probably, afflicted by my own particular lens on things. He certainly lived the lifestyle of a dissolute aristocrat. I will certainly give you that. Okay.
Yeah, we've got one more question in the chat, and then can we go to you, Benjamin? Or you're muted, just so is that okay?
Absolutely, please,
Okay.
please. I'm going to follow up on what from
yes. So
book,
first we'll go to Jay and then to Benjamin. Jay is asking a question about Sweden.
Okay.
Also thinking this question could be about like pan-Scandinavianism or the Nordic impacts of these debates. So Jay's question is, to what extent is this debate important in the Swedish context at the same time? Is Sweden mostly responding to Brandes and Denmark? And of course, that question could be applied to other Nordics.
Okay, Sweden is a special case. And I did not talk about this at all in my introduction. Amber is here. Amber was the editor of this book and did an immense job of keeping me on track. I can confess that for every word that made it into the introduction into the book, 2 were deleted. So I have a double size deleted material document. One thing I could not do is get into what really happened in 1889, 1890, and 1891. Because there's more to this story. There was a Swedish figure, his name is Ola Hansson, I believe, who also claims to have discovered Nietzsche. And as I understand it, Hansson was, so by this point, much of Brandes's income and fame comes from his role as he's the primary mediator between Scandinavian literature and Germany, right? So Brandes publishes an article about a Scandinavian writer in Deutsche Rundschau, and every German goes out and buys the book, right? This dynamic went on for a long time. Ola Hansson was a rival of Brandes and was trying to sort of take that title away from him, right? So there is a party of Hansonists who believe that he's actually the guy who discovered Nietzsche and first wrote about him. I disagree with them. I don't know much about that, but I do believe, as far as I understand, that the reception in Sweden was more facilitated by Hansson, right? It has a different arc of development in the 1890s. And I think Nietzsche becomes more important in Swedish literature than he does in Danish, right? Because already you have, it's been a long time since I taught these books. The crime novel from the early 20th century in Sweden, written, it's not gonna come to me. You get Edith Södergren, eventually, you get a number of great Swedish modernists, right? Hjalmar Söderberg, right? I think that novel is influenced by Hansson's Nietzsche. Södergren is deeply influenced, and a number of the other Swedish modernists take a lot of cues from Nietzsche in a way that I think was less true in Denmark. Okay.
We take Benjamin's question now.
Sure, it was just a small point, just a reference for Troy in case he cares to follow up on that. William, you do write, and this is from page 37 of your text, injecting Kierkegaard into kind of the conceptual universe of Nietzsche, and then by extension Brandes, and by extension Høffding. It certainly sounds like, but you write that Nietzsche is possessed of a similar structure of thought to Kierkegaard, in that his understanding the journey toward becoming truly human also begins with the recognition of one's insufficiency.
Right. I've forgotten about that part.
Not before the good or before God, but before culture. But in that sense, you do some work also to bring this conversation within terms that Kierkegaard operates in.
Absolutely. Unworthiness is a central category for both Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. I'm thinking of the Wayne's World scene from the movie. I am unworthy, right? For Kierkegaard, you begin life in the aesthetic. You live for pleasure. At some point, you make the transition to the ethical and then the religious. And the religious transition is ultimately motivated by a crisis in which you become aware of the distance between yourself and God, right? And for Nietzsche, God's dead, of course. But at least in Nietzsche, as Brandes presents him, God is culture, is art, right? And the task of education, as he describes in the Untimely Meditations, I think it's Schopenhauer as educator and the role in the uses of history, is the process that goes on in the young person is an awareness, a coming to an awareness of the distance between yourself and the great figures of culture, right? And you can choose, you can make a choice then. I mean, a very small handful of individuals will say, well, I'm going to be one of them too, and I'm going to destroy everything that came before me, right? But there can be a somewhat larger circle of young people who understand what is above me, but that which I cannot reach, right? And I can dedicate my life to helping the great individual reach the stars effectively, right?
We just have 3 minutes before the hour and a half is up. So I think it's a good time to say thank you again. Thanks so much, William. Thank you, Benjamin, for bringing this conversation to us. Thanks to everyone for coming. Yeah, this was great. I really enjoyed it. I hope everyone else enjoyed it too. And thank you.
I'm really happy. Thank you. Thank you so much to everyone. Thanks,
Thank
Ben.
you.
William and Benjamin. And as people leave, I'm just going to do a shameless plug in the chat. The University of Wisconsin Press, I put a link in there to the book. So if you're interested in reading it, you can find a copy there. And also a shameless plug to support SAS so that we can continue to do events like this. Again, thank you so much for coming, everyone. And thank you, William and Ben, for this event, and Olivia for hosting. Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.